There was some speculation I saw, and I thought it was quite good, that if Trump can keep these tariffs, it basically puts him in the role of a deal doer for the rest of his presidency, and that could set him up to become even richer than Vladimir Putin. Because that's how you would do it. It's extra. I'm not a conspiracy theory type of guy, but it's just obvious that there are conspiracies all over the place, and that there is such rampant tolerance of things that are so obviously and easily corrupted that it's not going to take long if it isn't happening already. I mean, we already have a crypto coin. If you want to line the pockets of the President of the United States or the First Lady, you get your choice of the fund that you deposit into.
Yeah.
I mean, just think of that. Wow. It's really something. So there you are, James Baker or Al Capone. Welcome to another edition of a podcast. I was very proud of myself for thinking of the title of the podcast series, which is Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality. And since then, the collisions we've been having with reality have been becoming progressively more uncomfortable. So I'm here with my friend and colleague, Jean Tunny. We are going to try to have a conversation about Trump's tariffs, at the same time as produce a primer for anyone who wants to listen in. And we won't assume any economic knowledge, but we will assume some economic curiosity. So anyway, we'll just see how we go. And I guess I would say on my own behalf that I'm really not, I don't much like the term expert anyway, but I'm certainly not posing as an expert here. There are, as you will discover, there are two aspects, a micro and a macro aspect. I know quite a lot about the microeconomics of international trade, wrote my PhD on that and on policy and on its interface with policy. But hey, this is a very urgent, complex situation in which, as you'll hear us discuss, economic models tell us only a small amount, give us only a small amount of the answer of what's going on and what to do about it.
Yeah.
So without further ado then, Jean Tunny, tell me what your reaction to these tariffs are. And I think we should sort of steer the conversation broadly. So we talk about the microeconomics of the tariffs. In fact, you might even introduce the distinction between the microeconomics and the macro aspects of the tariffs, and then tell us what you think of the micro aspects.
Yes. Well, I mean, honestly, I'm horrified by the tariffs. And I think we should note that we're recording this on Monday, 7th of April.
Yes, that's
because
right.
Things are happening so fast. I mean, the Asian markets are down. I think China and Japan down 6%, Hong Kong down 10%, Australia's down 4% today. That's added on to how much we were down last week. It's very concerning. And now Jim Cramer's come out and said that if Trump doesn't sort this out soon, if he doesn't get these deals in place, then we could have another 1929 situation or 1987. I mean, something of that magnitude. Yeah. So, hugely concerning. I suppose with the microeconomics versus the macro, I mean, with the micro, we're talking
Well, let's just define what we mean by the difference between those things.
Yes, I mean, microeconomics, we're looking at, we're usually looking at the firms or households. So we're looking at things in the small sort of units rather than the whole economy and thinking about how they all fit together.
Yeah, so we're looking at the ways in which this tariff might change the extent to which the United States or Australia invest in manufacturing versus services. So so it's about resource allocation largely in domestic markets. That's one way to describe it, and then have a crack at defining what the international, I call it international macro, what the international macro, what would we, if I said, what's the international macro story behind these tariffs? So what are we talking about then?
Well, I think with the international macro, this is about how everything fits together when you look at how all of the individual decisions, add up, really. And the problem
but they're macro aggregates. So, So I'm thinking, sorry, you go.
So the microeconomic models for international trade are very, you'd say, stylized, or there's no time dimension really in them, and you have resources moving from one activity to another costlessly. Yep. So the economy will respond in a way to the tariff, and people still stay employed. So there's full employment. It's just a matter of where they're allocated, whether they're in manufacturing or whether they're in agriculture, etc. Now, the thing with macro is that you take into account the short term, what happens when there's a shock to the economy, such as a tariff, and if there's suddenly a change in demand. So if there's suddenly a change in the US demand for Australian wine because they're sticking a tariff on it, then there could be fewer people employed in the vineyards in the Barossa or in Riverina.
But I still call that micro. So I think macro is about things like what Donald Trump has talked about, which is US trade deficits. And there's lots of talk about, the people who are defending these tariffs at a popular level, they're talking about manufacturing in America, but the smarter ones, the smarter ones and the ones who are into international grand strategy are talking about the role of the United States as the reserve currency for trade and investment around the world, the way in which that has, and I thought we might talk about that after we've talked about the micro, the way in which that has increased demand for American dollars and led to the sort of situation that we're in with America running a endless trade deficit and running up large foreign debts. So anyway,
I think that's right. Now, Trump's solution to that, I think we need to talk about why Trump's solution to that doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, let's do that when we get to that. So let's talk about micro first.
Yep.
Now, we wrote a paper recently, and we were kind of quite proud of it, I think, because we were the only people that in the game saying that bringing an idea to the table, which at the same time was an old idea in economics, but also a very familiar idea to anyone who's been on a playground, which is that life is often quite good for bullies, certainly in the short term, if they're big and stronger than other people. And so the way in which we expressed the modeling was to say that these policies are really, some South American countries, some small South American countries have pursued policies like this, and they've been a fairly instant disaster. And we were arguing that, at least in terms of economic models, I think there are other reasons for arguing there'll be a fairly immediate disaster as we're seeing, but at least in terms of the economic models, there is actually an argument that is rarely discussed by economists. In fact, you might even argue that it's almost suppressed. I guess it's more subconscious than conscious. That actually says that there is a case for a large country imposing tariffs, certainly considering the situation just from its point of view. So do you want to take us through that?
Yes, this is the so-called optimal tariff, and this goes back to, I think there may be a classical economist you mentioned, but it certainly goes back to Nicholas Kaldor and to Richard Kahn. And, there was a lot written on it in the late 30s and 40s as building on the Heckscher-Ohlin model of international trade, which is a classic model of international trade. And essentially, if you're a large country and you've got buying power, then you can influence the terms of trade on which you purchase. Theoretically, there's the possibility that you can levy a tariff, and what that means is that when you cut back your consumption of that commodity, of that good, the foreign the exporter will actually discount it slightly so that the reduction in consumption, your consumption from or your purchases from them are not as large. So they will wear some of the burden. Now that's not the same thing as saying that that they pay for it, but they do. Yeah, they pay for a little bit of it, I suppose. They wear some of the incidents.
Yeah, and the way we put it is that when Donald Trump says foreigners will pay the tariff, they're wrong, but he's not completely wrong. And that's something which economists have been largely describing this as if he is completely wrong. Now, for Australian listeners to this, I was quite intrigued by this and interested in this because Australia itself is a small country, but we're not a small country when it comes to exporting aluminium or coal or iron ore, particularly iron ore, because we're closer to China than other major sources. and the quality of our iron ore is stellar. Now, I don't say that from personal experience, but I'm told that some parts of it, one of the reasons why it's the red centre is that it's rust. And I think I read somewhere that some iron ore from the Pilbara is something like 45% iron. I mean, it's just amazing. And so we are a huge exporter of iron ore, and that means that as we crank up production to shift it, we cut the price a bit. And we will continue to do that until it becomes not worth our while. We're not making as much profits from expanding production. So it's true also for us. And when the Productivity Commission was modelling the unilateral reduction of car tariffs a decade or so ago, we weren't negotiating anything with other countries. We were just saying it was important to get tariffs down below 15%. And if you took into account that effect, which is a very indirect effect because the causal pathway is Australia imports more cars, therefore it needs to export more to pay for it, and some of that will be more iron ore, and some of that will involve a lower iron ore price, and that will lower returns to Australia. If you took that into account, the optimal tariff just for cars was around about 15%. So I was arguing that we shouldn't reduce the tariff any further unless we were doing it in the context of a deal, which, for instance, and this might come up later, we did with the United States of all countries, and we cut our tariffs to zero with the United States because we had a free trade agreement. That's a whole different ballgame. Now, what happened then was that the Productivity Commission, which wanted to argue that we should lower the tariffs more, just fiddled with their model to get rid of that effect. And that was a little bit sad, I thought, but that's what happened. So anyway, this issue of the optimal tariff argument is now something that is of some relevance to what's going on in the United States.
Yeah. So on the Australian situation, I mean, I would argue that we were right. Sorry?
Yeah, you probably don't agree, and that's obviously not tolerated on this podcast.
Well, we have to accept that. Okay, so it is a tax. So when you look at the economics of the optimal tariff, I mean, you're essentially recognizing that this is a way that you could raise revenue, and the revenue is a transfer from the households or the businesses that are paying for it to the government. Okay, which is essentially the households and the businesses, it's representing them. So that essentially cancels out in the welfare analysis when we weigh up, what's the optimal tariff. So we're without drawing diagrams, but essentially what we're doing is we're trying to figure out, is there a positive rate of tariff that's non-zero that is welfare enhancing, that actually leads to a net gain for the country. And it turns out that if you can impose some cost on the foreigners that they have to reduce their prices.
Yep.
Or on the other hand, I think what you're talking about, if you can actually increase your export prices by reducing the exports that you need to do to match the imports, because you're reducing imports, so you can export less and for the same current account balance.
That's right.
Then you get a welfare gain from that. You get a welfare loss from less trade. So there's less trade, so you get less consumer surplus.
Right. That's right.
It's a matter of what do those
you trade the two off.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you do that in a model because it's way too abstract a thing for us to get our heads around it in any other way. And the model tells you that the optimal tariff for a car is about 15%. Now, some people who became apoplectic at my argument, who shall remain nameless here, but I'll point you to them if you'd like, said that this was just outrageous and that if I wanted to do this, I should be imposing export taxes. Now, they're quite right that if I was interested in this argument as a source of new policy ideas, that's true, but I wasn't doing that at all. All I was saying is we have a simple question to answer. Without negotiating this with any other country, should we lower car tariffs? And if we put that into our model and we're honest about the modelling, the answer comes back, it will lower our welfare marginally. Why would we do that? Anyway, that's what we did.
I'd like to know the people who you thought should remain nameless.
Harry Clark.
Ah, right.
It's on my blog, and it was all very, it was all very quite heated. I don't think I it was back in the days of vigorous blog debate, and it was kind of, in my opinion, it was a kind of a misunderstanding because, but because I think Harry accepted the basic logic and then said, but if I wanted to go with that logic, I'd be wanting to do something else. At which point I said, yes, but the logic is simply a yes or no question to a policy, and the question is, should we lower tariffs? Answer, it'll lower welfare. So the answer is no.
Right. Yes, but I guess what I would say is that lowering tariffs is still going to reduce the cost of cars to the consumers, and if you keep the tariff in place, you've got higher taxes than otherwise. So if you're supporting lower taxes, it's still a positive thing.
Well, they are different things, but I'm very happy. I mean, I would point out that because of this effect, these tariffs were unusually efficient taxation. So they and basically the Australian budget had to make up for the loss of revenue, and I think it was about $1 billion, $1 billion annually, for cutting car tariffs. So that's a wash. You're just looking for. It's quite right that I'm actually arguing. I think that argument is on my side of the ledger, because I'm saying you can't say this is lower taxes because, again, that's a macroeconomic question. So if you lower these taxes, you get less revenue, and yes, you get lower car prices, but then you've got to raise revenue in some other way, and that has its own damaging effects. And what I'm saying with the car tariffs at 15% is that you've stumbled upon a very efficient form of taxation. Don't leave it until you can. And I won't go into why. It's still a good case. It's still a good thing to negotiate away in return for better access to other people's markets, because then you get something for it.
Well, anyway, I remember you had a good debate with the PC. You and Peter Dixon had a really vigorous debate at the time.
We did.
Yes,
we did. They didn't even let me into their modelling workshop, but there you are. These wounds from decades ago. I'm not. I don't take it personally, but it was a bit silly, I thought.
Okay, but it's true that the case for an optimal tariff is stronger for a country like the US, which is large, than it is for Australia.
Yeah, but and so perhaps this is a good opportunity, having dwelt on that perhaps for too long. Perhaps that's a good opportunity to say, all right, so we think, so let me try to explain what we said was clever about these tariffs, because then that'll be short, and then we'll have a long time to explain why they're completely mad. What's smart about these tariffs is that if you consider the position of the United States acting unilaterally, in other words, you kind of imagine the rest of the world as a sort of inert mass, which is roughly the way Donald Trump thinks, perhaps, then it turns out that even though economists tell you tariffs are terrible, it turns out that if you could be confident that other countries wouldn't retaliate, they just sit there and do what they're doing already, then it would actually make sense for the US to impose some tariffs, because in doing so, they get foreigners to pay a little bit of those tariffs. You good with that? I mean, that's
right. Yeah, and the loss from and it works in the model, because the actual loss from the reduction in trade, because you can, in these theoretical models, you can easily sort of divert to domestic production or consumption to domestic goods. The actual loss doesn't turn out to be that large. It's a triangle, so to speak.
That's right.
When you draw the stylized diagram, you end up with a triangle.
That's right.
Yes.
I'll sort of try. I might even see how I go in trying to describe that, which is that everyone's seen a supply and demand diagram with the scissors, and it turns out that as you model the loss from producing things in your own country that are not the absolute optimal things to produce, you end up creating spaces on that diagram that are small triangles, and the tariff that you impose appears in the diagram as a long rectangle. And it turns out, and so the way I think about it is that if you get a small slice of a long rectangle, that can be a lot better than some tiny triangle at the end of these diagrams. Anyway, that's for those who've ever drawn a supply and demand diagram. That's one introduction to it. So now I think we should say, from a microeconomic perspective, what is wrong with these tariff cuts?
Okay.
Where do you start? I'll let you start.
Well, it depends on whether you call this micro or macro. But I mean, I would say that the problem is that you're assuming that the reallocation occurs occurs painlessly. I mean, you're assuming no retaliation from other countries.
I'm calling that micro. That's
okay.
All micro.
And then you're assuming that the resources in your own economy are able to, be reallocated to the industry to start producing the goods that are now more expensive. And you don't have to invest in new capital equipment. You don't have to retool. Like, these are all adjustment costs that need to be considered when you're working out whether this is a sensible thing to do or not. And that's not in those stylized models, right?
That's right.
So
that's right.
You've got a certain amount of capital, you've got a certain amount of labor, and you can either produce good X or good Y, right? So it's they're very stylized models.
Yeah. So the costs that are not being taken into account, let's try and identify them. So firstly, the costs that were not taken into account, I think there are a bunch of kind of very unusual things about this Trump thing. So I want to get to those after we've considered the fairly standard ones. And the way you've discussed this, what you've said are fairly standard things, which is that the adjustment costs, you've got to get workers out of one place and into another. You've got to get investment going. These things take time and so on. And the cost can be quite substantial. However, one of the stronger points of globalization, one of the strongest points of neoliberalism in Australia and the United States is that you're going for an end state which is quite a bit better than where you started. And so the argument, and also you're doing a lot of different things at the same time, and economies are fairly dynamic. We spend a lot of our time saying how terrible it is that people lose their jobs, but the number of people who lost their jobs because of changes in tariffs in Australia or the United States are a tiny fraction of the number of people who lose their jobs every year. There is a lot of turnover in the labour market, and so there's a kind of a preciousness in saying you've got these costs. And I guess I feel that the really important lessons from the globalization, and I think Paul Krugman thinks this, is that economists underestimated the extent to which these effects could be very localized and very strongly negative for communities. And they didn't really pay enough attention to those things. So that's the normal. Anyway, there is some, I guess I'd like also to point out that if Australia had kept its tariffs on cars, certainly on cars, somewhat less on textiles, clothing and footwear, we wouldn't actually have that many more jobs in those sectors, because those sectors were there was huge productivity growth in those sectors, and people were being replaced by robots faster than they were being replaced by imports. So had we, even if we still produced cars in Australia in the kind of quantities that we used to, it wouldn't be a huge impact on employment. And that doesn't, there are some other arguments where you might say, I'd be quite happy to entertain the idea that it was worth paying something to keep those industries, but it's not as an employer is a small part of what those industries might be able to contribute, and an increasingly small part of what they might be able to contribute. Just go and look at how many people are employed in Nagoya in a car assembly factory. Amazingly few, where there used to be maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people in a huge shed, in a huge facility. There might be 100 now, if you're lucky, really. Anyway, so...
And the other point you always make is about the supply chain too, don't you? Because this, like the economic models or the stylized ones you learn about in international trade theory, they don't often consider the supply chain, and that a lot of these tariffs will end up being paid by the businesses who are importing.
So now I think that's right. So I think we're now getting into the more extraordinary aspects of this policy, and they are extraordinary. So the first point is that these models that we have, these macroeconomic models of trade, come from a world in which really misled a lot of economists as we navigated globalization into thinking that a country specialized in an industry like coal, and it would export the coal and import the cars. And in fact, with that in mind, when the European Union, the now European Union, the EEC as it was then, the European Economic Community, introduced free trade within Europe, lots of economists thought that the automotive industry of all of those countries but one would collapse, because one of the countries would win the war to produce cars, would attract economies of scale in producing cars, and would wipe out the others. And I think people expected that to be the Germans. Now, I think the Germans have done better than the others. It's all history now because they're not doing very well now. But the Germans did better in cars than France and Italy and Britain. But they all did well under free trade because the world economy is very complicated, and these economies of scale are not purely over the whole industry. They're for nuts and bolts and drivetrains and pistons and castings and seat assemblies and you name it. And that was and so that expanded, and people and so the building of a car in Europe became this extremely complex process. And so if you bring an economic model to that, which will kind of assume that one party will end up making seats and another party will end up making wheels and so on, it's very misleading. And so this is what Trump has done. He's introduced these costs, and the costs are just, if you think about all of the trade between Canada, around Detroit. So you've got, is Winnipeg, is that in Canada, and is it next to Detroit? Anyway, it's in there's Toronto's nearby. So you've got this Canada US border around Detroit, and you've got this massive amount of trade, and a car, so an engine might be assembled in Canada and then sent back from parts from all around the world, and then sent back to Detroit for final assembly, or vice versa, or sent down to Louisiana or wherever. So it's just incredibly complicated. And then along comes the tax man and says, I'll have 40% tariffs or whatever he's imposed on the particular country in mind. And so each of these facilities has got business people thinking, well, should I invest in this? Should I maintain the investment? What will we be doing in 5 years' time? They've got no idea what to do now.
Yeah, exactly. I'll have to check. I think isn't there a carve out for the automotive industry?
Oh, well, I think they started working on a carve out, but the example is nevertheless, this will be the case in pretty much any complex manufacturing industry.
Oh, yeah.
And this is what's so completely nuts about it. And then there's the sort of simple issue of the rule of law. Do you want to talk about that, or shall I soliloquize again?
Well, I quite enjoy your soliloquizing. I mean, it makes it easy for me. I thought it'd be worth pointing out that if you do the optimal tariff calculation for the US, based on what we think are reasonable assumptions of elasticity, so how much
the tariff affects how much the foreigners pay.
Exactly. Then you get probably for the US, you could justify a minimum. Now, this is not looking at specific countries or commodities. If we just look in the aggregate, you could justify, say, a 14% tariff at a minimum, some maybe toward 20% even, or even higher, depending on the elasticity. So but that's from that very stylized model, and originally from Richard Kahn, who was one of Keynes's disciples, who elegantly sort of set it out in the Review of Economic Studies. It's one of the best written economics articles I've read. It's quite impressive. I don't think they write them that well nowadays. But yes, that I just wanted to point that out. So the way that the Trump administration's gone about calculating these tariffs, it's got nothing to do with any sort of optimal tariff theory. They've used some bizarre formula. They may have used ChatGPT to help them calculate the rates, and they've ended up imposing tariffs on islands with penguins. The McDonald and Herd Islands. So it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
It's complete comedy.
And in excess of what an optimal tariff might be if you do it using the proper formula. So
and we've got very serious doubts as to whether you should be following that formula. But if you were,
true,
that's right. So I want to make a final point. It's a micro point. It's a macro point. It's an everything point, really. And it's kind of, I will assert that it's not only more important than everything we've talked about so far. It's much more important than everything we've talked about so far, and it gets mentioned. It's not a secret, but it doesn't get the prominence that it deserves, because you can't say the same thing again and again and again and keep people entertained. And as we all know, we will march into Armageddon with entertainment that's what runs our society. And what I'm talking about is the rule of law and the idea that you can rely on the United States, that you can make a deal with the United States. Now, Donald Trump signed a new version of NAFTA, the agreement with Canada and Mexico himself. I think it was in 2017. It was certainly in his first term as president. And he's now using an extraordinary, I mean that in a technical sense, not in a hysterical sense. He's now using an extraordinary authorization he has from Congress. It's Congress's job to set tariffs. And Congress has legislated a whole bunch of things to do with tariffs, and they've legislated the power of the president to vary those tariffs for reasons of international security, I think is the term. And so Trump just says these are all to do with international security. When it first started being talked about, that was occasionally mentioned. It's now barely mentioned. But the point is that Trump, why would we expect to buy submarines from the United States? Why would anyone do a deal with the United States? Why would you enter a free trade agreement or any other kind of agreement with a state that just behaves like a gangster behaves, which is they just keep the agreement for as long as they think it's in their interest? And I want to add that sadly, perhaps, or anyway, realistically in international relations, there actually can't be too naive about countries. Countries will act in their long-term self-interest, and that will sometimes involve breaking their word. But breaking one's word in such an utterly capricious way is simply saying to people, well, we might be big, we might be powerful, and you need us, and that's certainly true. But that's certainly true that most countries need the United States on side. But if you do any deals with us, you'll know that we're not interested in constraining ourselves in any way. We'll say we will, but then so would Al Capone if he's dividing up Chicago. That's what you're dealing with. That's extraordinary, completely extraordinary. And yeah, that no senior Republican has said we can't behave like this. This is just massively against our own personal interests, and it's obviously against the interests of the world.
Yeah,
anyway,
I mean the people who are speaking out now, it's the Wall Street types, and I mean it's Jim Cramer. He's super mad. So I mean I don't know to what extent they'll be influential, but I think people are waking up now that it's directly costing them.
Well, it is interesting that the two Congress people who are proposing for Congress to take back control, if I can use that loaded term, to pass an act to take control of this situation, are Republicans, two of the three. So there you are. There's some signs of the U.S. Constitution responding in the way that its designers intended it to respond.
Oh, good. Is that Rand Paul?
No. I'll get you the names.
So no, Rand Paul has spoken out against it.
Right.
If I remember correctly, yeah.
So Chuck Grassley, and so there are two bills now being proposed, one by Chuck Grassley and Maria Cantwell in the Senate, and one by Don Bacon in the House of Representatives. And Bacon and Grassley are Republicans. And then this is Noah Smith commenting in a post he put up a few, in the last hour or so. Democrats, by and large, have not been at the forefront of the fight. And that's also kind of interesting and significant because there are plenty, the more principled, the more radical Democrats have been such critics of neoliberalism and such critics of globalization that they're kind of a bit timid about the fact that their thunder has been stolen. So, for instance, Bernie Sanders, who I'm a big fan of, really one of the few Congress people who strikes me as really very principled, is sort of tying himself in knots, saying, yes, he was against unfettered free trade and tariffs are kind of okay. And I think most of that's nonsense. But anyway, certainly for a country as dominant as the United States, it's pretty, it makes sense for it to be in favor of free trade. Anyway, well, maybe we talk about that a little bit more when we start talking about international macro.
Yeah. Well, I guess up until up until Trump, really, I mean, the sort of accepted view was that it was in the United States' interest to have free trade throughout the world because that helped lift up emerging economies, developing economies, that increased their standard of living.
And also the United States is sitting at the top of these industrial stacks with the most profitable bits, the most profitable leading edge bits. And of course, well, I think one can take Bernie Sanders' concerns seriously, but respond just out of the economic textbook to say, if your problem is an equity problem, then address it with tools that are built for equity. Address it with things like, in some of the ways that Bill Clinton did, and you might want to do more of this with earned income tax credits, various kinds of targeted industry policy to regions that have been hit. You could have done a lot more of that. And in fact, Australia, Australia wasn't brilliant at any of this stuff, but a federation, it's one of the ways in which a federation like the United States and Australia are better placed than Europe, which is not a federation, because you get a large amount of, here's a bit of economic jargon, horizontal fiscal equalization. The states that are prospering pay much more tax than the states that are suffering, and so that creates a large transfer from the states that are doing well to the states that are doing less well. And anyway, that's a tool. That's a much more benign tool for equity than tariffs, I would argue anyway.
And I think the big issue in the States, one of the big problems they've got is they don't have a decent public healthcare system, right? So, we're fortunate. We've got Medicare, Britain's got NHS, and they've got their problems, right? And there's an issue of how do you control demand?
Exactly.
How do you provide a decent level of service? But it's much better for all their faults. I mean, it's much better than what they've got in the States, where you've got people really full.
And you might be able to, it's an open question how much you could actually build an effective private system. But unfortunately, the American system is scandalously rent-seeking, scandalously susceptible to rent-seeking, to the point that they spend when I last looked, something like 20% of GDP on health, more than twice as much as other people. And there are large parts of the population that are more or less cut out of the health system. I mean, it's a terrible state of affairs.
And you have a situation where a health insurance CEO gets gunned down in Midtown Manhattan, and people cheer. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, he was supposed to be not such a bad guy either.
Yeah, terrible.
But well, that's right. There's that. Yes, and I thought you were going to say something else, which is that pretty much any American family knows that they're one major health problem away from bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, two. There are two things standing between them and bankruptcy: a major health problem, followed by, let's say they're insured and they get kicked off their insurance.
Yeah.
Or they find that the fine print enables the insurance company to walk away. Just a terrible state of affairs.
Exactly. Nicholas, there's one thing I think it'd be good for us to sort of talk about before we wrap up.
Yeah, well, we haven't even really got into macro, so you
well, that's where we're going. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, is that what you were going to say?
Yes, I was going to ask you about the macro.
Yeah. So that's kind of more interesting, just in the sense that, well, one thing we haven't said about the micro is that none of this makes any sense because America's quite close to full employment. So none of it makes any sense. I mean, all the kind of the idea of bringing manufacturing back to the United States, and there's lots of manufacturing. In fact, I do want to go on more about micro. There's a lot, but the idea that we want more manufacturing in the United States, well, that's great. Tell us what you want less of, because you're going to have to take labor from other places and put it into manufacturing to the extent that manufacturing expands demand. Let me say one other thing about this, that one of the arguments, well, I'll put this under macro, which is that one of the arguments is that America's manufacturing is hollowed out. We heard this sort of thing about Australia, and I think it's much more plausible about Australia because Australia is a much smaller place. I don't think it's possible to kind of produce manufacturing real enfeeblement in the United States. It's just not possible because it's so huge. It's so huge that you can argue for and against. So think about the Reagan years. One of the things that Ronald Reagan did was there was quite a lot of penetration of the American automotive market by Japanese producers, flooding the market with these things. But that was starting from a position where there was a tiny share of imports. I don't know. I should have looked it up before we started talking. I haven't, but I would be surprised if the import penetration of the United States when this became a big issue was more than 20%. And the free market response is, yeah. The Japanese are going to keep doing this. They're going to expand, but they're not going to get to 95%. They're not going to get to 60%. They probably won't get to 40%. But there will be big changes, and America will be left with a smaller, lean automotive industry. Now, that's quite different for Australia. It's quite now that doesn't justify tariffs. So you've got to go through a longer period of thinking to work out whether you want to have a car industry in Australia. All sorts of different considerations. But the way that the nature of the debate about manufacturing in Australia, in the United States, is very like Australia's, and it shouldn't be, because the United States, in the words my economic history teacher Mac Booch, who may no longer be with us, I don't know, I haven't stayed in touch with him, but my economic history teacher used to say to me, "Why would you take any interest in the United States as an example of economic history? It's just big and rich." And what he meant by that is that it was incredibly hard for the United States to do anything that was generated too much self-harm, because it's so damn big that it sort of solves these problems. And it's much more interesting to think about, well, what should Australia do, and should Australia decide to have a car industry? Because America will always have a car industry. It just mightn't have as big a car industry as otherwise. So I think that's pretty important. And the Americans are also talking about military. They're also, and I'll now start segueing into macro.
Well, can I just ask you about
you
made a point about full employment. I'm trying to understand the point, because the optimal tariff models assume full employment.
Yeah. So it's not an optimal tariff. It's a separate argument, which is we've got 2% of our workforce, 3%, 4% who are unemployed, and we can do all this manufacturing ourselves, and that'll keep them in, and that's an employment policy. And that was sort of one of the things that justified Australia's high tariffs from the 30s on. And it was, in fact, how Keynes just sort of touched the tripwire in our discipline by saying in the 1930s that tariffs would be an appropriate temporary measure, because you need to expand the economy, and you can't expand the economy with fixed exchange rates. This is a great segue into macro. You can't expand the economy with fixed exchange rates on the gold standard, because you just run out of money. Gold departs the country as the country buys all these imports. So he said, look, it's more important. We're making a difficult trade-off here. It's more important to target full employment than it is to target the absolutely optimal pattern of investment and production in the British economy. Very sound, sensible argument. Everyone was horrified. Now, with the Australian experience, you can bring some ammo to the table and say that there are very few temporary tariffs. You introduce them for temporary purposes, and then when you try and get rid of them, you get all kinds of lobby groups and so on trying to stop you. So that takes us into international macro, and that is a completely different way of looking at this, which is to say that the United States has been running a very large trade deficit for a long time. To run a trade deficit, you have to borrow. So you buy more stuff than you produce, and so you have to sell assets to get this. So to get more. I'm using cars the whole time. Cars are okay to discuss this. To get another 100,000 Chinese and Japanese cars, they end up buying. So the transaction is Americans get the cars and the foreigners get something, and the Americans give the Japanese car companies and the Chinese car companies, or the Chinese government, all these American dollars, and then they go and put them, then they go and lend them back to the United States. So this is the idea that, and of course, Donald Trump has got this thing about trade balances. He's even got it bilaterally. So, of course, I think it would be pretty easy to understand that you'll always run some trade deficits with some countries and trade surpluses with other countries, depending on what you're good at producing and bad at producing. But the United States does run a large trade surplus. It's grown since the 70s. Yeah. Sorry.
It runs a trade deficit. $1 trillion trade deficit.
Yeah, that's right. And that is building America's foreign debt and basically undermining its role as the global hegemon. That's kind of roughly the idea.
Yeah. Can we be clear that, like this is what happens in aggregate. So we're talking about how these what ends up happening, what we see in the data through just national income accounting conventions, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not the actual the trade deficit itself that means you have to borrow the money, but what happens is because of the adjustment of the exchange rate to bring about the balance of payments, it so happens that you end up with the capital inflow, the net capital inflow, your capital account surplus balances out the current account deficit.
Well, that was why I was trying to take people through that transaction in a way that they could relate to as a householder.
Yes.
Which is that if you're buying more in your house than you're getting paid in fact, this is a better way to explain it. If you're buying a new car and you add up all your costs with your groceries and your mortgage and all this stuff, and you buy a nice $60,000 car one year, you can't afford that, so you borrow that amount. You borrow the additional amount that you need to buy that car.
Yes.
And that's what the United States have been doing since the 70s.
Yeah,
just more and more of this.
Yeah, so that's the way to tell the story. I mean, another way of like from a macro perspective, I mean, what's going on is because you could spin it in a way that, well, there's such great investment opportunities in the US. Everyone wants to buy US Treasury bonds because they're a safe asset. Everyone wants to invest in the US, so they want US dollars. And what that means is that foreigners are willing, so all of the, Deutsche Bank or HSBC on behalf of their clients and the central banks around the world, they're willing to pay enough for US dollars that means the US can have a sufficiently valuable exchange rate that they can, they can go and purchase all of these imports at good prices from overseas, and they don't have to export the same amount because people are willing to send capital, net capital inflows to the US.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's the situation. And of course, it is connected to the fact that the US dollar is the global reserve currency.
Yes.
So lots of people need American dollars to trade. So if Brazil is buying from Argentina, then they're likely to do it in American dollars, and they need American dollars to do that. So all of these things inflate America's exchange rate, and certainly in the short and medium term, that's good news for Americans if they can stay at full employment because their assets are worth more, they can buy more, they can consume more, and so on. And the question is, does this undermine the position of the Americans as they borrow more and more and more? And someone like Ray Dalio, a great investor, would argue that the answer is yes. And he's basically shown that we've had these waves of global trading hegemons, starting with the Dutch in the 16th, 17th century, and they basically got themselves over leveraged, and then the British took over, and then the British got themselves over leveraged by fighting 2 world wars, and they were basically broke. They basically sold all their assets by that point, and the United States ended. I think, here's a factoid for you, I think this is true. At the end of World War II, Fort Knox held 80% of all the gold in central banks in the world.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Again, as my economic history teacher said, that's the golden rule, and the person with all the gold makes the rules. And that's basically what the United States did in in this famous conference of Bretton Woods. And so they set up, after all the experience of the Great Depression with competitive exchange rate manipulation, tariffs, and so on, they set up this thing, the Bretton Woods Agreement, which essentially fixed, it was a sort of, tell me if you think this is a reasonable description, a kind of simulated gold standard. I'll explain what a gold standard is to listeners. It's essentially that countries trade internally according to their own currency and their current, and then they trade internationally using gold. And that fairly quickly turns into an arrangement where domestic currency is pegged to gold. And what that means is that, so countries don't control their own exchange rate. And so they get forced into these situations where, to maintain their domestic currency's connection with the traditional gold price, they will have to essentially, they raise and lower interest rates, central bank interest rates, but they also raise and lower economic activity. And so if you're trying to hit this exchange rate, you are forced, as the UK was in 1925, according to a pamphlet by John Maynard Keynes, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, trying to return to the old pre-World War I gold parity, basically imposed a depression on the United Kingdom. So that was the way in which countries, that was a world in which a country could kind of go broke, and going broke was breaking your country's domestic peg with gold. And that is the world. That's the world in which people are right to worry about trade deficits. And since then, we've basically Richard Nixon put an end to this regime of fixed exchange rates next to gold, and that was when the American trade balance started going negative and has gone negative ever since.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a bit of a.
But then the point is, I mean, in the Bretton Woods era, like the way to deal with that trade deficit, or if you had that problem and you had the balance of payments crisis, as Britain did repeatedly through the 60s and 70s, the way to deal with it wasn't through tariffs. I mean, at the time we were trying to, there was a global push to reduce tariffs for freer trade. It was through, they devalue their currency in the end. They'd hold on as long as they can, and then eventually they'd have to devalue. And I mean, there's that famous, Harold Wilson, there's that extraordinary video where he tried to claim that the pound in your pocket isn't worth anything less. I don't know if you've seen that.
No, you better send that to me.
Trying to justify the devaluation. I mean, it was quite humiliating, really. He's saying, we're still buying a pound in British shops, and everyone sort of knew, actually, no.
All right, so this is the argument that, this is, I guess, that you might call it the end of days argument, although that's maybe confusing things. But it is this idea that the American empire is over, and that America, so it's kind of part of America first. We are not going to run this regime because it eventually leads us to bankruptcy. And so the tariffs, they're an attempt to tax foreigners rather than Americans, and they're an attempt to retrench this very large trade deficit. And I know what I think of that. I know what I think of the macroeconomics of that. I'll first ask you, and then I'll either agree with you and we'll move on, or I'll put my view.
Yeah, okay. So just on I don't want to create the impression that we think the foreigners will end up paying the bulk of the tariffs.
No, they'll pay a small amount. Yeah, that's right.
I think they'll pay a fraction of it. The consumers, domestic consumers, will end up paying the bulk of it, because it's the importer who pays for it at the docks. Sorry, what was your question? I mean, what you were saying sounded reasonable to me. Was there?
So will these large tariffs improve the United States trade deficit?
I mean, they may well do, but I don't think that's a legitimate. I don't think that's the right way to go about improving the US
I don't think
deficit.
they will. I don't think they will, because if you ask yourself what drives deficits, it's macroeconomic factors.
Yes,
it's the fact that, and so Americans have got used to consuming far more than they produce, and that's kind of politically locked in. So in the election that we've just had in the United States, the two parties, I think Kamala Harris's policies were said to lead to deficits of about 5% of GDP, government deficits of 5% of GDP. You can argue for that you might run small deficits over a long period of time, but if you want to argue that, but running deficits of that size is living beyond your means. And the Trump promises amounted to living further beyond one's means, largely, I presume, because of the corporate tax cuts that he had in mind. So so this is all, I think, kind of double talk. So if you want to be tough, if you want to rein in the American trade deficit, you have to tell us your plans for lowering the consumption of Americans. That's what will rein in the trade deficit.
Well, isn't that?
And that's part of that.
Well, that's part of the plan, isn't it? I mean, that's what's got to happen if you're imposing.
Yeah, but they're not saying that.
No, they're not.
They're saying the opposite of that.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. And we had a similar debate in our country. So this was in the 80s, the Pitchford thesis. So those who are old enough and have a good memory, and others might be interested, when the Hawke Labor government got in 1983, the economy took off. It was bound to take off because it had just been through a big recession. The economy took off, but I think it was, and also because of globalization, there was quite a lot of investment going in. A lot of that investment was financial investment, not fixed investment. That's a problem. Turned out to be a problem, and we should have seen it as a problem. But what that meant was that we started running large trade deficits. And this then became, everyone started freaking out about this. And they were and that was sort of because, I think a reasonable description of that, a reasonable explanation for that was that instinct was right back in the Bretton Woods days.
Yeah, correct.
And it was wrong once you had deregulated a lot of finance, particularly let the exchange rate float and so on. And so if you had a problem that Australia was living beyond its means, then think of ways to make us produce more and consume less. And jacking up interest rates isn't a good way to do that. So anyway, that's what we did. We worried about the macroeconomics of running a large trade deficit, and eventually we got over that after a big fat recession and said, well, maybe we shouldn't be targeting that. And that was roughly right. I mean, I could quibble, but that was roughly right. And likewise, and so the Americans are making a kind of similar mistake, thinking that tariffs, which are essentially a microeconomic measure, are going to have much of an impact on this thing. And of course, it's much better politics to talk about tariffs. Everyone likes tariffs. They can say how it's good for American manufacturing, and it disguises the fact that if you want to get over this problem of running deficits, you have to become more productive, or reduce consumption, and that's not a nice message to campaign on.
Increase domestic savings and have the Americans
lend
more, buy more of the bonds rather than the Chinese or the Japanese.
That's right. And I think Australia's cranking up of superannuation contributions, compulsory superannuation contributions, while done in a way that I think was pretty unfair, because it's, the burden of the taxation regime, and it's a flat tax, which I think should be far more progressive. But as a piece of macroeconomic policy, I think it's an important contribution to living beyond our means, and one of the reasons why we've been able to turn trade deficits into trade surpluses and so on.
Yeah, it's a good point. So because there was that policy push, there was that national saving report, I remember. Did Vince Fitzgerald write that? Right. And Karen Chester, I think, worked on that?
That's right. Well, I was in John Dawkins' office, the Treasurer's office, while that was commissioned.
Right, because I remember reading it at uni because it had just come out. And fascinating.
I will tell you a secret about that. I think secrets can be shared this long with this bigger gap. Maybe somebody else has said it, but John Dawkins gave Paul Keating 1 hour's notice of the announcement of the Vince Fitzgerald, of the appointment of Vince Fitzgerald. So,
right.
I think that's right. He might. I'm pretty sure that's right. Anyway,
did that cause any issues? Did that cause an explosion?
I can't tell you. I didn't see any fireworks, and I think it was Dawkins sort of saying, "I'm the treasurer. You don't take me for granted." Good on him in a way.
Keating was probably, by that stage, he was more interested in the cultural and issues, wasn't he, rather than the economic?
Well, it was good. Anyway, it was a very good thing to be talking about. So it was good leadership by him. The other, my other thing was I watched the Treasurer and the Prime Minister decide whether or not to have a tariff pause during that period, and it was a very low key discussion. And Keating just said, "Oh, I don't think we'll do it," and they didn't do it.
Right.
It was. It was quite strange to watch. Yeah. But anyway, we were all sitting around in the Prime Minister's office. One of these situations where I'm pretty sure, maybe there were other ministers there, but so it wasn't the ultimate decision, but it was really the decision that mattered. And Dawkins and Keating were just talking to each other, and I think the officials were in the respectful circle around them.
Yeah.
And it was just, I was really quite struck with how low-key, how unrhetorical it was. That's partly, I think, because both of them didn't want to do it, but Dawkins was a friskier kind of minister, and I think he might. So it was a bit from memory. It was really quite like a conversation where two people are sort of feeling around for the right an answer they can both be happy with, and Keating summed it up and said, "Look, I think we'll leave it as it is," and that was the end of the meeting.
Leaving it as it is.
Leaving the tariff. That's right. Yeah. Sorry, that's ambiguous. So we'll leave tariffs one of Keating's great achievements as Treasurer. Tariffs were trending down, and this came up. Should there be a tariff pause? And they had a discussion, decided no.
Yeah. Just on before we wrap up, I just want to mention there was something interesting I heard on I was watching one of Brian Tyler Cohen, I forget, is that his name? One of the US commentators, and he was talking about...
Yeah, well, I'm aware of somebody called Brian Tyler Cowen, and they're different to Tyler Cowen.
Oh, yes. Oh, sorry, I messed it up, yes.
No, well, anyway, he's called Brian Tyler Cowen, and I'm presuming he's not Tyler Cowen. Are you talking about
different?
Tyler
Yeah, he's different.
He's a different person.
Yeah, he is. Sorry, I think I didn't pronounce his name properly.
That's all right.
But essentially, he had this interesting... It was talking about the tariffs and just how wacky it all is. And he said, look, there's a reason we have a trade deficit with Madagascar, right? Because we're importing a lot of vanilla from them, and they're not rich enough to buy, much from us. So it doesn't make any sense for us to then go and put this huge tariff on Madagascar, right? It's just insane. We're still going to have to get the vanilla from them, and we'll end up paying more.
Nice
for vanilla.
Example. Yeah. Very good.
Yeah, I'll send you the link. I thought that was a really neat little way to describe
it's just complete. Mind you, the basic story that China and Germany have been running at, well, I guess the Middle Eastern states are a bit different because they're so commodity driven. But China and Germany have basically built their economic strategy around exporting more than they import. And that is essentially their economic strategy is exporting unemployment to the rest of the world. And that won't work out well for them in the long term. There's a rainbow, there's a silver lining in this cloud, which is that should change. Maybe it will, but the alternative is we just get a 1930 style trade war. So that's not really terribly good.
And the way we dealt with these things in more sensible times was, you think about how James Baker arranged the Plaza Accords at Plaza Hotel in New York City, right? You get the parties together and you have the conversation. You don't go and slap tariffs on them. You tell Japan, you've got to let your exchange rate appreciate.
Yeah. Exactly.
So that's the way to deal with it, right?
So James Baker as a model of economic coordination compared with Al Capone. That's I think you think that analogy is extreme. I'm not so. I guess it is a bit, but I think it's you're happy with it. I'm gonna wrap up with that by drawing that distinction. You can find fragments in Donald Trump's thinking that are valid and indeed quite valuable given how countercultural they are, but what a nightmare. So why don't we, if you're happy with that summary of our situation, I will draw it to a close.
I'm very happy. I mean, the only thing we really didn't cover was whether you think this is just some 4D chess art of the deal type move.
Yeah, well, we don't know. That's speculation. And well, there was some speculation I saw, and I thought it was quite good, that if Trump can keep these tariffs, it basically puts him in the role of a deal doer for the rest of his presidency, and that could set him up to become even richer than Vladimir Putin, because that's how you would do it. It's extraordinary. I'm not a conspiracy theory type of guy, but it's just obvious that there are conspiracies all over the place, and that there is such rampant tolerance of things that are so obviously and easily corrupted that it's not going to take long if it isn't happening already. I mean, we already have a crypto coin. If you want to line the pockets of the President of the United States or the First Lady, you get your choice of the fund that you deposit into.
Yeah.
I mean, just think of that. Wow. It's really something. So there you are, James Baker or Al Capone. Until next time.
I agree. Very good.
And to see if our next collision with reality is more or less uncomfortable than this one.
Yeah. I think, we're in for a whole lot of pain still, I think. Yeah.
Oh, I think so.
Absolutely. Okay. Thanks, Nicholas. Okay. That was great.